come to the 13th presentation. And what we're looking at here is the harmonic of the set. The 12 presentations make the set, and the 13th both retrospectively threads them together and then prospectively carries the harmonic of the set so that it can be further utilized. As we have investigated and from many different angles over several thousands of years of human genius, is a special kind of a cascade of dimensions. Phenomenal nature in its cycle carries with it the 4 dimensions of space-time all the way through the cycle, except for the original context of space-time. So that someone who is following an integral cycle carefully will begin with a designated numbering with 0 and not with 1. This has become a characteristic of very high human intelligence for several thousand years now. We talked about how the first major thinker to present this aspect of nature in the pristine way in which it has been characterized the last 1900 years was Nagarjuna, originally from South India, who developed what was called the middle way. That the Madhyamika, the middle way, was the thread by which the great way, the Mahayana, could be discerned, and that the discernment was that there was a pair that were not causally in contact in any way whatsoever, yet by tuning to that pair, one was able to follow the middle way, the Madhyamika, all the way through to illuminate the Mahayana, the great way. The pair were Shunyata and Tathata. Tathata being translated best by thusness or suchness, connotating an existentiality. Shunyata designating emptiness, the void. The best English word for it is emptiness, and we took a look at Nagarjuna's 70 sutras, 70 stanzas sutra, A Buddhist Psychology of Emptiness. And it is important for us to understand and realize that this pair is a pair of 0 and 1. And that the 0 and 1 do not touch. There is no causality between them. That existentiality cannot have a precedent phenomenally. The stanza 32 translates this way. If we examine composite phenomena and non-composite phenomena, then we cannot find them as one. Because then we cannot differentiate between these 2 types of phenomena. And we cannot find them as many. Because then these 2 would be completely unrelated. If a composite phenomena is asserted to exist, then it cannot arise because it is already existent. And if it is asserted not to exist, then it cannot arise because it is non-existent. If it is asserted to be both existent and non-existent, this is not possible because such a state is contradictory. Every different type of phenomenon is included within this criterion of non-inherent existence. This was composed and written somewhere around 150 AD. The classic planetary wisdom locus of this is about 500 BC. And the locus was not in India, but in Greece. And the philosopher was Parmenides. And the classic way to just simply present the conundrum, Parmenides said, what is, and what isn't, isn't. This was in Parmenides' long philosophic mystical poem, The Way of Truth. Parmenides' way was a presentation of Pythagorean community refinement, so that it goes back originally to Pythagoras and his discernment that whatever occurs existentially occurs because it has a mutual resonance between each other. And the classic way of stating that was to develop the idea for the first time of the importance of a series of ratios, that the ratioing of existentiality is a superior way of indexing what exists in terms of the shared forces between them. That retrospectively, one of the most powerful architectural building tools in the Old Kingdom of Egypt, they were not so sophisticated as we would expect from the pyramids and other monuments, but they were able to find 2/3 of any relationality. They knew that particular ratio. That was their golden mean, 2/3. That by 2/3, one could cut it in half and discover what a third was, so that what was missing from the 2/3 was findable. Pythagoras, some almost 1,500 years after the founding of the Old Kingdom, came to understand that there are 3 primordial ratios that form a set. And the set that they form was presented as 10 dots in a triangle. It's called the tetrachus. A single dot, underneath which there were 2 dots, under which there were 3 dots, and then concluding under that there were 4 dots. That one could find the ratio of 1 to 2, of 2 to 3, of 3 to 4, and that this was commutable all the way through, and that if one totaled the dots, one came up with a 10. And the idea of a perfect 10 was the idea that the 1 and a 0 are presented together as a meaningful set, which for the first time establishes that there is a cyclic integral running through the line of cardinality. That number is an element within an arrangement that can be discerned, and that the discernment of the ratio can be determined accurately if one introduces the idea of ordinality into cardinality, that a line of integral, an integral line, can be indexed by powers, in this case, powers of 10. That one counts up to 99, and then one has 100 where there are 2 zeros. And that by having powers of 10 in ordinality, one is able then to arrange the linearity of the integral in a variety of ways called mathematics. That previous to that, counting was based on arithmetic, and that Pythagoras transformed the arithmetical principles into possibilities of a mathematical transform. 700 years after Parmenides, we come to Nagarjuna, and we come to understand that by incorporating a 0 before the existentiality of cardinality or ordinality is, the phrase in our time is, it's a game changer. It changes the way in which we are able to understand an integral, that it does not self-define, that existentiality and its path integral is not able to determine itself in terms of itself. And this allows then for transforms of possibilities in a mathematic mode to enter into and change. Not just change as in a variation, but to change as in a transformation, the very integral path and the ratioing, indexing understanding. And we see in the last couple of presentations that this came to a tremendous sea change about 300 years ago with the publication of Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. The highest Mathematica is that one is able, if you take the set of 0 and 1, you can have an infinitesimal exactness in between them that will apply to existentiality and apply to the forces, and that in this way one can mathematize physicality, phenomenality. In our time, physicists use mathematics in exactly this way, and following on Newton, within about 50 years, you began to have mathematical genius on a level that had never been really seen before in the world, publicly, and the development of about 100 years after Newton's Principia in the 1780s and into the beginning of the 19th century, you began to have very powerful transforms. Last week we talked about the Fourier transform, the Fourier series, that there are ways of correspondence where one can apply to one kind of an integral a second kind of an integral if one establishes the correlation into sets and transforms, and along with the Fourier transform at near the same time was the Laplace transform, etc. In our time, there are dozens, scores of transforms that are very powerful. One that we mentioned about 10 weeks ago was the Penrose transform. Today, we're going to mention the Weir transform. We're going to work our way into it by beginning to take Michio Kaku's hyperspace written in 1993, published in 1994, A Scientific Odyssey Through Parallel Universes, Time Warps, and the 10th Dimension. In his preface to Hyperspace, he writes, "We caution that the theory of hyperspace has not yet been experimentally confirmed and would in fact be exceedingly difficult to prove in the laboratory. However, the theory has already swept across the major physics research laboratories of the world and has irrevocably altered the scientific landscape of modern physics, generating a staggering number of research papers in the scientific literature, more than 5,000 already by 1993. And since then, into the tens of thousands. However, almost nothing has been written for the lay audience to explain the fascinating properties of higher dimensional space." And then he goes on to introduce and has a very interesting way of expressing himself later on. Consequently, many physicists are now convinced, 1993, that a conventional four-dimensional theory is too small to describe adequately the forces that describe our universe. In a four-dimensional theory, physicists have to squeeze together the forces of nature in a clumsy, unnatural fashion. Furthermore, this hybrid theory is incorrect. When expressed in dimensions beyond four, however, we have enough room to explain the fundamental forces in an elegant, self-contained fashion. My brief commentary on this. Much is too limited even in this writing. The term physicist, based exclusively on phenomena, physics. In Greek, the term is physis, which connotates emerging forms. They are emerging forms. They are coming into their existentiality. Thus, forces are included as being also phenomenal. The forces that usher in whatever is phenomenal are also then phenomenal. In our time, then, particles and waves, classically, are both included phenomenally in physics, and the math is styled to express this. One of the first great exceptions to this stylization was Richard Feynman's introduction of Feynman diagrams. That the math had become impossibly complex because in the higher math for quantum mechanical physics kept showing more and more that the computations, that the math began to express infinities that were not factorable. And they are precisely, exactly not factorable in an integral for the very same reason that true zero is not factorable. And in fact, to speak almost paradoxically, in a logical, analytic, one can substitute zero for infinity or vice versa and not disrupt the logical form. So that there is something resonant in a tunability of zero and infinity. And just as the problem of zero haunted mathematics from the time of Pythagoras and Parmenides to Nagarjuna and those who followed him, and those who followed Nagarjuna became increasingly sophisticated in thinking about shunyata, in thinking about tathata, in thinking about their set. And eventually, after about 200 years, came a very powerful, almost dominating school of thought in India called the Yogacara, the consciousness only theory. Sangha was the genius who first presented this. The error in assuming that one's structure of symbolic thought could integral consciousness in the thinking about it and that this was real was challenged only after nearly 500 years. It took a very long time for someone sophisticated enough, for someone whose practice and whose prismatic tunability was discernible to be able to see that this was not the case at all, was named Shantideva, one of the great, he's called a Buddhist saint. He was a professor at Nalanda University, one of the greatest intellectual universities, sort of the Harvard or the Sorbonne of its day in the 9th century, the 800s, early 800s AD. And Shantideva's great classic is called the Bodhicaryavatara. It is a 10-part, like the 10 dots of the Pythagorean tetrachus, of being able to look clearly at the qualities prismatically of one who is conscious, who in every way transcends the structure of symbolic thought in the sense that they are able to transform the structures of symbolic thought so as to disclose that the limitations are perimeters which can be exceeded, that one can go beyond whatever perimeters are able to be characterized symbolically by a structure of thought. And that this exceeding the perimeters has a paired quality. One can slip underneath the perimeters through a zero field, and one can go over the perimeters by an infinite field. And so one finds a very interesting kind of a transform. In the next generations in India, you find superior yogis who are able to look both underneath at the zero field and over all, arching all in the infinite field. And the classic way in which this was expressed in the Mahayana was by a yogi master named Naropa. And he developed 6 different complementary ratioable yogas. And the 6 yogas of Naropa are a classic beginning of the transform of the Mahayana into the Vajrayana, into the diamond way, from the great way. And that great way is the field of consciousness, to the diamond way, which is the refinement of a being who is conscious, who brings the field of consciousness into a personal, not a personal focus, but into a personal spectrum. And that personal spectrum has no ends. It is a spectrum which is infinitely expandable and infinitely refinable. And the great translation of Naropa was done by a very tough hombre named Marpa, and he's always known traditionally as Marpa the translator. His translation was that he could not find someone to convey what Naropa had disclosed in such a complex, refined way that there was almost no one that Marpa could teach. Eventually, he found the most unlikely initial student for this, and that initial student was named, and is named classically, Milarepa. So that there is a transmission from Shantideva to Naropa through a wild sage named Tilopa, through Marpa to Milarepa. And the development of Milarepa is that he did not deliver a yoga in the ordinary sense of understanding. Instead, he presented what is classically known and is translated into all the major languages of the world, the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. Each one of those songs is a facet of the jewel matrixed spirit person. And that spirit person is capable of having any number of facets in addition to that, so that the term 100,000 is just to disclose that it is more than one can count, more than what arithmetic computation can do, and it belongs to an infinite as well as a zero mathematic. This refinement of consciousness was not able to be taught in an integral way. It could only be passed on if there were, in fact, no way that the integrality of it could be discerned or imagined or thought of cleverly in a structure of symbolic thought. It had to be passed on in such a way that the zero was in complete complementarity to the infinity, so that the spirit person would realize this in a future which paired with a new past, because time now is in a differential spectrum and does not occur in a present moment at all, because the present moment has undergone a sea change. And instead of being a present, it is now presence. So that presence presents what the present represented. But the representation of the present moment, the now, the awareness of now, the power of the awareness of now is illusory, because it can be dissolved by presence, so that in its solution, it goes back into a zero field or forward into an infinite field simultaneously. This is a supersymmetry indeed. And we're getting to modern physics. We're getting to 21st century physics which will transcend phenomenality. And the Weir transform is one of those utilizations that will help us to do this. The difficulty for Marpa passing on the 6 yogas of Naropa to someone else was mitigated by the way that he dealt with Milarepa. Milarepa had discovered that he was a psychic genius, and in his psychic genius, he was able to control weather. There were a band of thieves, of robbers, who killed his mother, and Milarepa, in his super paranormal powers, made sure that his control of the weather killed all of those thieves, every single one of them. And then it occurred to him that he would never be able to be absolved from that murder, that mass murder, that crime. And so he went into a constant roaming around trying to find a way out of the dilemma that his supernormal powers had delivered to him, had put him into, the pickle. He came to Marpa's place, and Marpa decided through a deep intuition that he would use Milarepa as an exemplar of trying to find a way to deal with the unsolvability of the permanent stain, seemingly, on the character of Milarepa, so that he would never be able to be absolved of his crime, however justified it seemed initially. He had Milarepa convinced that if he built a stone monumental Chorten to the east, that he would be able to use that as a place of meditation whereby he could heal himself. When Milarepa finished building that, Marpa came out in great disgust and anger and said, "This is foolish. You should have built it in the west." So Milarepa had to dismantle all of that and then build it in the west. And when he was finished with that, Marpa castigated him again and said, "You do not understand. You took me literally of saying east when it was west, and you took literally east and west when it should be north." So he had to build a third. And he built that stone meditation monument altar to absolve himself of the guilt of the crime of having murdered this entire band of thieves, 40, 50 thieves who had murdered his mother. And Marpa came out again a 4th time and said, "No, you have to build it in the south." And so patiently, Milarepa did this and began to realize that there was an order going on and that he had covered the 4 directions. By building this stupa for meditation to absolve himself of an indelible guilt on his character. When he finished, Marpa said, "There is nothing I can do for you. You are incorrigible. You will never be able to absolve yourself." And so Milarepa left on the road out. In comes Marpa's wife, who castigated Marpa by saying he not only understands, but he has exemplified everything which you learned from the 6 yogas of Naropa. Go and bring him back. I want to feed him. And when Marpa came and fetched Milarepa, the turning of Milarepa from having given up every thought, every need, every possibility of being absolved of a stain indelible in his character, when he turned around and received the invitation back from Marpa because of Marpa's wife, he was absolved, he was healed, because he had gone back to the zero field absorption of primordiality in the zero field of nature that undercuts existentiality, undercuts the ritual actions of the world, undercuts the character that is formed by experience based on that, that is overseen by the integral of the symbolic structure of the mind. And Milarepa learned that you can create the learning matrix, but you cannot teach someone enlightenment. Later on, one of the great geniuses of all time came. He was the top university-level yogi at the time in Tibet. His name was Gampo Pa. He came to study under Milarepa and to learn the yoga, the 6 yogas of Naropa that had been translated by Marpa, that had been broadcast in the spiritual genius of Milarepa. And Milarepa's monastery, to put it in quotation marks, was one of the slopes of Mount Everest. So that Mount Everest was the ashram of Milarepa. We're going to take a little bit of a break because I don't want to truncate this story too much. Gampo Pa was told by Milarepa, you must have the right dream to open for you the gate for enlightenment. And Gampo Pa, night after night, had more and more fabulous dreams. And Naropa had said, come and wake me in the middle of the night and tell me the dreams while they're fresh. And for a whole long series of nights, Gampo Pa dreamt more and more grandiose, incredible scenarios. And finally, after some proverbial 40 nights, he slept all the way through the night and didn't dream. So he left. He wandered on the road out. He went back to his valley. And one day, he was thinking about Milarepa, who initially, when Gampo Pa had asked for instruction to reach enlightenment, Milarepa had pulled his gown up and showed him the calluses on his tushy, saying, this is the seat by which one wins enlightenment. Gampo Pa got up, he went to the door and opened it, and beheld that the entire valley was filled with about 5,000 young men studying under him. And word came that Milarepa had died. And he stood there and thought, I will never become enlightened then, because there was no one like Milarepa. And as this thought occurred to him, what washed through him were the words of many of the young men asking him, is there some special way by which we can study to learn what you learned? And he realized that he had been passed, as they say, the baton of enlightenment by Milarepa without him having known of it. And that when he realized it in the future, it recut the entire past with a new realization. And so he wrote a classic wisdom volume on the level of the Bodhikaryavitara of Shantideva, on the level of Naropa's 6 yogas, on the level of Milarepa's 100,000 songs. The jeweled matrix of liberation. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back. Let me just correct one title. Gampopa's classic is the jewel ornament of liberation. It's about a jewel matrix cosmos, but the jewel matrix cosmos was developed after that and through that. The Vajrayana is a distillation of the Mahayana, which was a fermentation of the Theravada, so that you have 3 levels. Starting next week, I will do a series, a set, which carries it further from the Vajrayana. And that series will be called the Parayana, the way beyond. Let's come back to what I identified earlier as the Weir transform. The mathematic by the early 21st century is now not only so complicated, but so extensive and growing, to use a mathematical term, asymptotically. There are more and more sophisticated aspects to mathematics being revealed, related, published, that it is almost impossible for someone to catch up or to stay up, much less to advance. And so I have introduced over several long decades, more than 4 decades, a transform of dimensions that allows us to look at the dimensions, the 4 dimensions of space-time, at the worlds of phenomenality, with even the forces being phenomenal, allows us to look at them in a transform expansion and a transform exactness, both together. And to do this by making a correspondence, a transform correspondence of phases to dimensions. And by taking the 4 dimensions of space-time and inverting them, reversing them, so that time, instead of being the 4th dimension, is the 1st dimension. And by doing so, one is able to go back to a threshold that occurred about 2,500 years ago that was world swath wide, of understanding that time is the binding by which space blossoms in an integral way and is able to maintain its phenomenality because its tunability now becomes a polarity. And that by being cinchable in polarity, the phenomenal world maintains its existence in cycles and passes it on. By making time the 1st dimension, out of which the 3 dimensions of space blossom together simultaneously, one is able then to understand the meaning of one of the most delicate transforms that is so impossible to initially imagine because it goes counter to common sense. And common sense is one of the arbiters, one of the qualifying determinants, as it were, for the integrality of experience, of images. Images integrate to the imagination, of feelings, where feeling tones integrate to a composed range that is associated with one's identity, and that language of images and feelings and words integrates into the symbolic structure of thought, largely in a way that must be opened by unlocking the sensibility of the polarity. The classic wisdom way to do this is to rotate the polarity by 90 degrees. If one takes a line and you put a finger in the middle of the beginning and end of the line, you now have two segments that are equal. One can do the same procedure by putting fingers in the middle of those two segments, and now you have four segments of a line. But their equalness, their existentiality, is actually arbitrary, because the beginning and end of that line, making it a line, is already an imposition. I used to call it, when I was younger, a cookie cutter. You cut out this line, and now you can deal with this line, A to B. If one looks back at the Pythagorean origins of geometry, still presented several hundred years later by Euclid in his plane geometry text that is still used, the Elements. The original Greek translates in such a way that the beginning of the Elements is precisely Pythagorean, because it translates as a point is a locus of no dimension. When it moves, it describes a line, but the line is not described from a point, but from a locus of no dimension that achieves a dynamic. So that the original line in Euclid's Elements is very Pythagorean. It is a vector that has emerged out of a locus of zero dimension. That a vector of dynamic can emerge spontaneously, even in consideration, out of a zero-dimension locus, is literally always a revelation when one comes to behold it. Not just to believe it, not just to understand it, but to behold that this occurs, and that this occurs not just in some magical moment, but it reoccurs all of the time iteratively. And that each time it occurs, you get a vibration. And energy is the vibrational, determinable integral of that iterative occurrence. So that existence is actually an occurrence of phenomenality out of a process by which a dynamic is able to make an energy frequency, many energy frequencies, and each particality will have a specific energy frequency. Each atom of each element has a universal frequency such that we now have a canvassing of our moon to determine what elements are there. And the discovery was summed up just yesterday that there's water all over the moon. There's water ice, but there are water molecules interspersed even at the equator of the moon in the dust, in the olivine, pyroxene. What is important for us is to understand that it is the energy frequency that characterizes the continual vibronic emergence. The true physics is the physis, the emergence of energy from a dynamic which emerges from a zero field. And because that zero field is an unlimited context within which a universe can occur, the universe has its own registry as a vibronic unity. It's difficult to move beyond a mind shaped by a structure of symbolic thought that has all of its experience in terms of this, based upon a phenomenality whose very existence is the base of this, unless one can literally do something which is almost impossible to do except for babies, and that is to go back to nature in its primordiality. Or to become born again in the sense of becoming a baby again, but not by becoming a baby going back to zero again, but by emerging originally in a presence that transforms the present moment into a pair, which is tunable. And the pair is a trans-time set. And the trans-time set, the phrase I gave to it quite some long while ago, was the future and the new past. But the future does not develop out of the present moment at all. The future and the new past occur as a pair together within the sense of presence which is in the field of differential consciousness. So that consciousness is not only a fifth dimension, it is in fact a field of infinite transform. So that consciousness is able, like a higher dimension would, to be able to deliver for us not just an overview of the four dimensions, but a penetrating, it's called an angle of vision, a penetrating insight all the way through the symbolic structure, the flow of experience, the phenomenal base upon which that flow occurs and is integrated by that structure all the way back to the zero field. It is commonly bandied about of 0 point energy, and this is a subtle misunderstanding. The field of nature being a zero, the field of consciousness being an infinite, when they presence together, those two fields weave, to use a poetic term. They weave a complementarity which is in its own play a 9-dimensional process. And that 9-dimensional process, like all processes, are fertile to emerge forms. The form that comes out in a 10-dimensional form is hyperspace. That 10-dimensional form now is like a third state of, we can't even say matter, we can't even say prism. It becomes a third kind, if you will, of existence, which has become spiritual existence. And the classic way to intuit it is that this is a divine existence. It is a form, but it is not a form of existential space-time perimeters. But in between whatever it occurs as and the phenomenal world of space-time existence, the mediating tunability of the two is the 6th-dimensional form of the spiritual person. But the immediate way in which that tunability occurs is to be able to take the structure of symbolic thought, mediated in the presence, the shared presence of the symbolic structure and the analytic structure of the cosmos. Here's how it reads when you speak ordinary high school language. One has to learn to move from theory to analytic in order to be able to do science. The assumption in the phenomenal arena, it is an assumption, and when it's exercised the way it has been over-exercised, it becomes a presumption. A presumption and a prepositioning of understanding so that one only gets a self-reflecting confirmation. There's no learning. There's just a dull learning by rote. The presumption is that theory occurs in the structure of symbolic thought. And this is a reabsorption on the basis of egotism, because theory actually occurs in the field of vision, not in the structure of symbols. One would never know this if it were not for something like the Weir transform of putting dimensions into phases. The 4 dimensions of space-time occur carried together through the 2nd phase, the 3rd phase, and integrated into the 4th phase. Space-time becomes then a self-contained triad that does not at all co-opt the zero field of nature, so that more and more the structure of symbolic thought, relying upon its own predilections and presumptions, becomes more and more abstract. More and more dried out, becomes more and more unnatural, and begins to consider that nature has to be recut in such a way that it now will fit into the rationality of the cycle. This, of course, is a fool's errand. But the hubris of assuming that that presumption is doable is to pull back short moments of insight out of the field of vision and to incorporate them into the symbolic structure as if it belonged to them in the first place, as if that's where it came in the first place. And this is called not having the theory occur in a field of vision, but to be instructed that we put this theory in your structure of thought, and that's where it belongs. This is called dumb rote teaching. This is called making the students do the homework, but not being at home without the work in a field of vision. What I have done is to take the cycle of nature so that one begins with nature as a zero and moves through a cycle, an integral cycle that comes to a fifth phase that has a classic designation. I use a Chinese template for this. It goes back to Lao Tzu, who was a contemporary of Pythagoras, and both of them were contemporaries of the historical Buddha. They all lived about the same time. They all were at the height of their powers about 500 BC. The zero phase of nature, Lao Tzu calls Tao. The one, that phase of ritual existentiality, of phenomenality. Not only the things, but the actions which now become limited ritual actions, so that both phenomena and karma are able to be lumped together as what one bases oneself on. And basically the karma is a time dimension and the phenomenality is a space structure. But if you put it space-time, it means then that your karma has blossomed out of the things and the actions that you have done. Whereas the high dharma is to reverse that, to inverse that, and to show that it is the time-boundedness that conditions existentiality and phenomenality so that the very structure of experience will be co-opted, so that the symbolic structure of the mind will be integral in such a way that in and of its own identification and habituality and traditions cannot discern beyond its forms, beyond the processes which have largely been limited to a mythic horizon of experience, of images, of language, of feeling, tones, so that one has to find a way to take the parenthetical presumptions of experience and bring them out of that into the field of vision, or to bring via a form that is able to operate in consciousness and bring the process that operates in that infinite field of consciousness via the prism of a person who differentially, like a jewel, embodies the refinement of the spectrum, and that process that flows in the context of the infinite field of differential consciousness is history. One can bring the kaleidoscopic process of history and bring it into play in the mythic horizon. Or one can bring the mythic horizon into vision. If one brings the mythic horizon into vision, it's the reaching back and maturing the character beyond the limitations of the structure of symbolic thought. And the classic way to do this is to make the symbols transparent. If one can see through the symbols to the vision beyond, then you have an opportunity which was not there before. Instead of seeing reflected in the liminality, like the mirror, showing oneself only what images in the mirror, only what feelings record in this reflective process. A language which limits itself to identifications of correlations and correspondences that fit within this integral. When babies learn to talk first, they jabber. They jabber gibberish. They are training not only their larynx and their tongue and their capacity to utter human sounds, but they are calibrating their breath. Because in order to speak like I am speaking, or you would speak, we have to modify our breath in kind of femtosecond level about 60 times per unit of femtoseconds. The modulation of air, of breath, of breathing, so that language in our way of just ordinary speaking is a colossal refinement. And babies, when they find this, when they find the capacity to say a word, mama, da, da, they repeat it over and over again because it becomes like a true mantra that one can speak and be heard, and can now hear when someone speaks that word to them, they hear it. They hear it as language. This is the beginning where the character has learned to hear through the symbolic structure of sound. And when they learn to read, they learn to see through the printed language. So that when one reads a book, one reads through the language. One reads through the words. And you teach children to read by having them make pictures of what it is that they're reading, of what these words are. Dick runs after Jane, who has stolen his ball. And the language in speaking delivers sound first in this transparent way, so that sound is the beginnings of the awareness of a consciousness as distinct from an awareness of present physicality, followed by sight. In ancient yoga, the Sanskrit term for the primordiality of the sound that makes symbols transparent is sphota, S-P-H-O-T-A. So that when one learns Indian music, ragas, and so forth, one learns the primordiality of sound brought into its full aesthetic blossoming of musical compositions and forms. Let's come back to the Chinese. The Tao, zero, the Te, oneness, together as a set make a two, but the two has a particular quality that is borrowed, if you will. It's like adding numbers that are larger than single-digit numbers, and you carry the remainder over. The carrying over of the pairedness, not the binary or duality, but the pairedness of 0 and 1 makes 1 capable of being expressed as 1/2 plus 1/2, and each half is itself a unity, but a unity in the sense that they are polarities that can become one. And the classic way to do this in China was to say that Te becomes yin and yang, becomes light and dark, becomes male and female. It becomes a polarity. Each half of that polarity is itself a unity capable of reassembling its unification as one. The two can become one. The one can be expanded to a polarized two. And the Chinese word for that two is Zhen, means human-heartedness, in the sense that only by having human-heartedness between two can those two become one. Now, technically, it can apply to two yangs, to two yins. They also can achieve a unification, so that Zhen, human-heartedness, means that the two are able to come back into the one, into the Te, into their power together as a unity, because both have a common field of Tao out of which they have occurred in the first place. Confucius writing always chose to write on the basis of Zhen. And so if you read the Analects, the Lunyu of Confucius, is constantly talking about Zhen, not about Tao. He's assuming that one can't really talk about Tao. One can really talk about Zhen, because this is where we come into play in our inter-character quality of our experience. The fourth phase is I, which are the symbols, the I Ching, the book of the symbols. The symbols tie together. They throw together. Greek symbolion means literally cast together so that they occur as a single explosive unity. They're integral. One grasps. This is what it means. The symbols bring the meaning together in graspability. And so the I are given a designation of 3. They bring the first form, like a triangle. It isn't just a line, it's these 3 lines. It's this shape. It's this triangularity. But it has started with Tao, with that 0 field, so that the space within a shape, within a symbolic shape, is in reality the same space that is outside of it. One has just put the symbol in the midst, and the I Ching in several places, the phrase translates, heaven suspends its emblems. Heaven suspends its emblems, which now can be worked with as emblems, And we carry with it our understanding that the suspension now is not only universal, it not only applies to the entire cycle of Tao, Te, Gen, E, but is carryable forward by a special kind of an energy. And that special kind of energy, the Chinese pronunciation now is qi. When I was young, it used to be translated to be pronounced in English as qi, qi. The Chinese character for qi originally was the character for the steam of fresh cooked rice. That when this existential grain is cooked through your experience of the tradition of how to steam it and cook it, and then is served, the steam of that rice is the key of it. So that the key is the conscious steam that the entire cycle, when it is presented as a nourishment, this is what occurs. And that the key has a particular quality. It can penetrate back into Tao. True key goes back to Tao in such a way that the next femtosecond that the Te, the unity, occurs out of that now steamed Tao, that keyed up Tao, to use English in a paradoxical way, every single iteration of its existence is now magical. It's no longer just existential, it is magical. So that what can come out of that is an experience that is not just based on existentiality, but upon transformable magical phenomenality. It's sparkling, it's charged, it's carbonated. It's no longer just water. It can be Pepsi. Something has happened there, and in putting this into phases, so that the fifth phase vision, what is quintessential about consciousness is being able to live in that conscious dimension long enough to be able to get used to the fact that it is not just the spur of the moment insight, but is a dimensional, quintessential quality. And that quality is not integral at all, it's differential. So that the form of the character that is brought through the symbolic structure of thought into the field of vision long enough to begin to presence there, what emerges is the spirit person as a six-dimensional prismatic being. And this six-dimensional being, when acting in the kaleidoscopic process that will come out of that, generates history. So that history is a preparation for the analytic quality. You can't do science unless you know what went before, where you're at, where the cutting edge is. And that always is generated by persons who are able to bring out of their vision the capacity to make a new presentation. Let's try this, so that experience now is transformable by experiment. And experiment is an indelible quality, a scintillation, if you will, of historical experience. Experiment now becomes a way in which the magic becomes science. Classically, it's said this way. The water that has been fermented into wine can be distilled into cognac. The grain that has been transformed twice over from goat grass by mixing another kind of goat grass with it, you get an emmer. And by doing that a second time, you transform the emmer into bread wheat. One has a couple of grains at the stalk. Emmer has about 16, bread wheat has about 32. But each time the energy of its existentiality goes into the grains, and it loses the capacity that original goat grass had to seed itself because it has chaff that the wind would carry and seed it. And with emmer, it's more and more difficult for it because it has less that the wind can pick up. And with bread wheat, it is so heavy because it has absorbed the entire phenomenality that it falls directly where it is and can only be harvested and farmed if the human hand picks it up and sows the grain. That's the only way that bread wheat continues then. Otherwise, it would go out of existence because it would limit itself more and more simply to falling where nature would leave it. Spiritual persons save the cosmos from galaxy to galaxy by learning what to do and how to harvest and how to bring the superior dimensions into play. The next series will be the Parayana of how this is going to happen. I'm going to run over just a little bit. One of the classic teachers was Jesus. This is my old alchemical Egyptian high dharma symbol. This will be in my book on him. This is a book called the Pistis Sophia, the Faith Wisdom. It came to pass when Jesus had finished speaking these words unto his disciples that Mary Magdalene came forward and said, My Lord, how many years of the years of the world is a year of the light? Jesus answered and said unto Mary, A day of the light is 1,000 years in the world. Adam emerged with Eve about 4,000 BC. So those 4,000 years, up to Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and then 2,000 years for them, so that 6 days of years of the light have taken place since Adam and us presence here, so that the next 1,000 years will be a Sabbath in the light. So we're just beginning to be free. More next week.